Hello, welcome everyone. This is the International Peace Coalition. This is the 91st meeting that we've had in a row. I want to thank everybody who has been a regular on the International Peace Coalition and those who are new joining us today. My name is Anastasia Battle. I'll be your moderator, as well as Dennis Small and Dennis Speed, the co-moderators with me today. I'd like to remind people why we created this forum 91 weeks ago. And we did this because we wanted to bring together the international peace movement into one forum. It's been quite dysfunctional. There's been a lot of operations to keep people fighting amongst each other. And we wanted to create the ability for people to work together and have an open dialogue and coordinate our activities around the world. If we actually want to achieve true peace on the planet, then we need to find ways to be able to coordinate with one another around the world. And we've been doing a lot of work towards that. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. We'll have a number of opening speakers to start us off today, and then we'll go into a general discussion with the audience members. If you are online watching via video on YouTube or Rumble, you can get the Zoom link by going to the schillerinstitute.com and signing up to get registering to get the Zoom link today if you'd like to be part of the discussion. But to open us up today, I'd like to have Helga Zepp-LaRouche. She's the founder of the Schiller Institute and also the initiator of the International Peace Coalition. So thank you so much. Please go ahead, Helga.
Yes, good day and hello to all of you. We are experiencing a very unprecedented change in the strategic situation, and one can actually say these are tectonic shifts going on, which leave some people completely flabbergasted and they don't quite get what is going on. What one can say is that the so-called collective West, which tried to dominate the world through an unipolar world, especially after the end of the Cold War, no longer exists. With a little bit more than 4 weeks of Trump in the White House, there is a split between the United States and Europe, which is quite remarkable, but in my view, not to be ever fixed again. Now, the Europeans have not quite, reflected on the policy failure. The Ukraine war is as good as lost. Trump has said that he does not want to continue to supply weapons or money. And the Europeans are now saying they want to keep fueling the war by sending potentially European troops into Ukraine, which Trump already has refused to give a so-called American backstop for. So are the Europeans capable of doing this? If you look at the state of the economy in Great Britain, in France, and especially in Germany, which is in a free fall, it is completely unlikely. I mean, there are estimates by think tanks that it would require immediately 300,000 more troops from Europe, 250 billion euros, and that is just for starters. Is Europe capable of maintaining that? It is extremely doubtful. So the Europeans are unable to assess what happens, and even the effort to try to continue the war when it's lost would only increase the number of people dying for nothing. And obviously there is an amazing lack of reality in the thinking of the Europeans. I like in particular an image which was used by Patrick Lawrence, quoting some other person, Tom Harrington, who used the image that the Europeans who have been in the shadow, so to speak, of the Anglo-American dominance the whole time, always pretending to be strong, but in reality having zero sovereignty on their own, that they are like the Chihuahua who played in TV the role of a Doberman for many years, and all of a sudden is asked to play in real life a Doberman. And naturally, the poor Chihuahua is not up for the job and remains on the stage yelping helplessly. And I think that fits the image, if it wouldn't be so tragic, but I think sometimes a certain amount of irony is necessary. So at this point, the Europeans are changing the doorknob in Washington. First, Macron came supposedly representing the EU, however, not having coordinated with the other European Union members. Remember the outcry when Orban did something like that at the beginning of the Hungarian presidency. Then, he was politely, basically treated by Trump, but nothing in substance. Then Starmer came, the British Prime Minister, and he made a huge effort delivering an invitation from King Charles for a state visit, hoping to repair the Anglo-American special relationship. But when the question came, will the US give a backstop to a potential deployment of European troops to Ukraine? The answer was no. So no substance to that visit. When Kaja Kallas, the so-called foreign minister of the EU, arrived in Washington, there was no meeting for her, a complete snub. And I think today Zelensky is there supposedly to make this gigantic economic treaty whereby the United States will explore and exploit raw materials and resources in Ukraine. Now, if you look at that deal more closely, it could very well turn out to be a big nothing burger, because according to some Western scientific think tank, the raw materials in Ukraine have never been investigated thoroughly, and many of them are right now in a territory which is occupied by Russia. Also, when Starmer went to Kiev a couple of months ago to conclude a 100-year treaty with Ukraine, that also included already some agreement about who would exploit these raw materials. So I would not be surprised if this whole thing detonates as a nothing burger. In any case, it is not exactly something to be proud of, and I could say a lot more about that. So what is the reason? What is going on with the Europeans? I mean, the whole world is scratching their head and saying, what happened to these Europeans? I think I have quite a good understanding. It is the arrogance of power, because remember, in 2005, there was a referendum in France and in Holland about a European constitution, which was supposed to create some kind of a European state. Now that was rejected both overwhelmingly in France and in Holland, and they did not want to continue that. So a group of people, Amato and various others, got together and practically rewrote the European Constitution by changing only 5% of it, and then with a big trara, renamed it in Lisbon Treaty, because a treaty doesn't require a referendum. And then in great secrecy, they made these changes, juridical changes in all the paragraphs, but they never published that. The only thing they published at the time was the changes. So of a gigantic treaty, I think of altogether 1,500 pages, the parliamentarians, which were supposed to vote about it, would have had to change, to put the changes into the treaty, making it even more incomprehensible, because everything was in legal language. So the person who has not studies in Jura will be able to understand that, or not without much effort. And only because a student from Dresden then did the work and put in these changes and then published the whole thing, that the parliamentarians could read the treaty in its changed form before. Now that shows you that there was from the beginning an effort by the European bureaucracy and the governments to hide what they were doing. And it became clear later because when von der Leyen and Stoltenberg revealed that they want to have an extremely close relationship between the European Union and NATO, at a point where NATO was going global NATO, it really meant that the European empire, the EU empire, was tied to this global NATO expansion. Now, if you read the Lisbon Treaty, it is already now obliging all the members, if they are attacked or one of them is attacked, that they have to come to the military help to all the others. So it is de facto, given the overlapping membership between the EU and NATO, a de facto, a militarization of the EU. Now that militarization is going on full speed. You have right now the effort to increase the budgets, to make not only Germany war ready, but there is a tremendous propaganda. Yesterday, the first channel German TV had I felt like 10 minutes clip on how fantastic the working conditions are in Rheinmetall, the largest German weapons producer, how 2 new employees are now making a lot of money, they can afford to build a house. Total propaganda, leaving out completely that the reason why the shares of Rheinmetall are now 1,000% up since 22 is, they feed the war, they cause people to die. Now that was naturally not featured, so the German TV for that part has been turned into a propaganda tool of the war industry. It's absolutely disgusting. Now, will that work? I don't think so, because just now, President Putin, in his annual meeting with the SFB, I think that's the intelligence service, basically said that the first discussions with the United States were very promising. There was a pragmatic attitude, and they left the stereotypes of the previous administration and about the rules-based order and cliches, and basically came to a realistic dialogue. And he said, very importantly, that he thinks that there are now, due to the military victories of Russia, is the potential to create a European and even global permanent security architecture, whereby not the security of one country will be at the expense of another one, but that there will be an indivisible security approach. Now that is very much in line, if the language used is slightly different than what we have been pushing with the Schiller Institute and the IPC since the outbreak of the Ukrainian war, namely the need to have a new security and development architecture. So if Putin is now, based on his discussions with, or the Russian discussions with the United States, is talking about the possibility of such a global architecture, I think this is potentially a major change for the good, and opens the window for the settlement of all other conflicts around the globe, especially, hopefully, also the one in the Middle East. Now, to mention that, this is still not very, the so-called peace ceasefire is continuing with interruptions here and there. Today, a delegation of Israel and Qatar arrived in Cairo to discuss the second phase of the ceasefire. The ceasefire is more or less holding, not totally, but there was an exchange of 4, I think, dead hostages given by Hamas against more than 600 Palestinians. The situation in the West Bank remains horrible. 4 refugee camps were emptied. This is still in total disarray. And the Israelis also refuse to leave the Philadelphia corridor, the road between Israel and between Gaza and Egypt. The IDF has started to make an investigation about the colossal intelligence failure of the October 7th So on the 4th of March, there will be the Arab summit in Cairo to discuss the Egyptian plan to reconstruct Gaza with the Palestinians remaining there, countering the Trump proposal. So no sign yet that the Oasis plan is part of that. We have to therefore absolutely continue our mobilization. But hopefully, if this larger rapprochement between the United States, Russia, hopefully China is succeeding, including India, and then eventually all other countries, there is indeed an absolute sign of hope at the horizon. However, I think we, from the IPC coalition, should not yet go into retirement until that peace is safe. So I am really asking you to join our mobilization and continue the fight.
Thank you, Helga. And also thank you for this image that you painted for us of what's been happening in Europe. I think that was a very good image to use of the Chihuahua. Makes you feel kind of sorry for the Chihuahuas, actually, but okay. So next I'd like to go to our next speaker, who hopefully we were able to sort out some of our technical issues, but we have Ray McGovern, who's a former CIA analyst, co-founder of the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and a regular on the International Peace Coalition. Thank you so much for joining us, Ray. Do we have you
Thank
connected
you.
well?
Can I be heard?
Yes, excellent.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me back. I just listened to Helga, and like Helga, I'm very, very, very much wondering what the Europeans are going to do. Big question is, can they scuttle Trump's efforts to create a decent relationship with Russia and end this terrible war in Ukraine? I don't know. They have on their side the media. That's big. The media in our country and in Germany and elsewhere are really banging the drums against what Trump is trying to. I mean, let's face it. Bottom line is the bottom line, and the bottom line is peace is very bad for business, really bad for business. Now, my friend Dennis Kucinich and his wife Elizabeth have written an incredible piece analyzing what's happened to the stock in these arms makers productions. And curiously enough, as soon as it seemed like peace might be breaking out, the value of U.S. arms makers stocks went way down. Okay, luckily. And very deliberately, I don't have any stock in any arms production people. I don't have any stock in anything to be quite candid about it. But what happened in Europe? Oh, in Europe, the arms manufacturers, the people who profiteer on wars, their stock went up, says Dennis and Elizabeth Kucinich, and they have graphs and they have statistics. They're both specialists in this. You ought to read what they say. So, in the bottom line here, when we talk about cui bono, more war, it's clearly the military-industrial complex, which of course I have said is really the military-industrial congressional intelligence media academia think tank complex. And I always emphasize that media should be in all caps because it's the linchpin. Okay, so will the media be able to sabotage Trump and his laudable efforts to end the damn Cold War #2? I don't know. It will depend on people like us to make our voices heard, because despite the carnage, not only in Ukraine, but of course in Gaza, people who pretend to have moral authority I'm talking about the churches, the institutional church. They have not been able to find their voice. So it's really up to us to speak out and say, look, the whole business about Putin being the devil incarnate, the whole business about Russia being, well, not only evil, but also sort of a gas station posing as a country. What have we become that the President of the United States or Senator McCain would say that kind of thing? I woke up this morning to Rachmaninoff, and I had this vision. Here's this gas station, right? And the owner would say, "Hey, Rachmaninoff, get away from that board there, and fill those tires up." And Tchaikovsky, for God's sake, what are you doing here? Change that oil, Right. A country or a gas station posing as a country. So there's lots of insults and there's lots of obstacles. But I think Trump, for the nonce, is going to be able to succeed in working something out with Russia. And then the Europeans are going to say, oh my God, no more NATO. I mean, Trump has pretty much said no more NATO. Not only no more Ukraine in NATO, but no more NATO, for God's sake. Whoa, okay. So what are they going to do? Oh my God, well, you know what? There's a reason why the Europeans can't defend themselves. And, for me, it's pretty clear because I was working in the US government at a time where the Europeans couldn't defend themselves, but they depended on, guess who? Us, okay? Now they can't depend on us anymore. So what's to prevent them from asking us in a vernünftig, no, there's a German word named Vernunft, sei doch vernünftig, which means, for God's sake, be reasonable, okay? So if the Americans aren't thinking that Russia is a threat, and we can't depend on them anymore, my God, well, is Russia a threat? Do we really need to divert more funding from the people's needs, to meet this threat, which is now questionable? In other words, it's going to take months, in my view, for the Europeans to kind of acknowledge, okay, we were lying. When they're lying, okay, we're lying through our teeth, okay? The Russians are not going to come and take over all of Ukraine. Look, they don't want all of Ukraine. No Russian in their right mind would want all of Ukraine, all right? They're not going to go to Poland. They're not going to go to the Baltic states. They already stopped, for God's sake. Stop? The Russians stopped? Yeah. They stopped in March of 2022, just 6 weeks into the invasion of Ukraine, because they succeeded. Oh, the Russians succeeded? Yes, they succeeded in scaring the hell out of Zelensky, forcing him to the conference table, and concluding a deal. No Ukraine and NATO, a ceasefire. Ukraine, you can keep those provinces in the Donbass. Whoa, what a deal. What happened? The US and the UK nixed it, put the kibosh on it. So now the question is, can the media tell the American and the Europeans and the others, can the media say, all right, well, we led you down the primrose path. There's no threat from Russia. And now the Europeans are coming around to say, yeah, we have better things to do with our money. Let's work with Russia bilaterally, which is what should happen. So there's hope there, but it's going to take a long time. And the media being the crucible here is going to have to change for enough Americans and enough Europeans to realize that they've been had, so to speak. Meanwhile, it cannot be left unmentioned, the carnage in Gaza. In my view, at least as of last evening, it looks like Netanyahu will go off and renew the genocide and do not blench before that word. So what do we Americans do then? Well, 2 days ago was the anniversary of Aaron Bushnell, who self-immolated in front of the Israeli embassy. And before he lit himself afire, he said, I can't in good conscience stay alive in a country that is responsible for genocide. And so I'm doing this crucial act. Now, what I'd like to leave you with is our responsibility to do something. And my friend Dan Berrigan said often, the difference between not doing anything and doing something is everything. The difference between not doing anything and doing something is everything. And Aaron left us the day before on Facebook saying this, look, I used to ask myself, what would I do if I were alive during slavery or during other atrocities? Well, you know, we ought to all ask ourselves, what would I do? Well, with respect to the Gaza genocide, the answer is clear. You're doing it now, right now. End quote. Footnote by me. If you're doing nothing, you're doing something really not quite responsible for a citizen of a democracy. I'll leave it at that. I'm sorry I have to be so confusing about the picture that I draw of the Europeans, but I've lived in Europe for 5 years, and I know some Europeans, and I'm totally mystified by how childish, I can't even call them adolescents anymore, how childish they're acting in response to this beautiful opportunity for peace, and how long it's taking them to realize that when Trump says, you know, we don't really have a dog in this fight, as LBJ used to say. You know, we have this one beautiful ocean that the Europeans don't have. And so if you're a European listening to that, what are you likely to conclude? Well, that Trump has his head screwed on in terms of priorities, and his priority is to finish this deal with the Russians. It's going to take a while. Not clear that he can succeed, but I wish him well in this. I'm dismayed by his policies toward Gaza. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray, for joining us and giving your analysis of what's going on in the world. And yeah, we're definitely compiling everything right now on what's happening with the children in Europe and how they're responding right now. So thank you so much for giving that presentation. We actually have an expert who's come on today to join us in this analysis. We have Professor Jerome Ravenet, professor of philosophy at Aix-en-Provence in France. He's a doctor at multiple universities in Paris and an author of a thesis on Xi Jinping's thinking and known opponent of the Western narrative. So I really want to welcome Professor Ravenet to this discussion. Please go ahead.
Merci. Merci. J'espère que vous m'entendez.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. First of all, I'd like to thank Mrs. Zepp-Larouche for the initiatives of the Schiller Institute and for this International Peace Coalition in particular. And I'd also like to greet and to thank Mr. Cheminade for his invitation. What we can call the speech of Chicago by Tony Blair, which he gave in Chicago in 1999, has become the sad compass of our ruling class, Europeanist ruling class, which has been justified through clever sophistry, defending the values that are openly warlike. The sophistry consists of labeling as dangerous not those who would threaten those values, but whoever dares to refuse their own hegemony. This discourse is implemented through a method that is limited to an avalanche of pejorative judgments, going as far as reductio ad Hitlerum. These judgments essentially target Russian and Chinese interlocutors that must be absolutely subdued. And in the official doctrine of the European Union, China is always designated as an economic partner and a systematic rival. And let's not forget that going against the tide of peace negotiations right now, the EU has escalated this week against Russia by announcing a 16th round of sanctions. So it goes without saying that these Europeanists are convinced that they are right and that they are reason itself. But when one plays at who's right, when one wants to persuade one's interlocutors that they are wrong, when one demonizes them, when one designates them as adversaries that must absolutely be subdued, when one thus conceives the relationship with the other essentially as a relationship of power or domination, one certainly does not increase the collective chances of achieving a common peace. On the contrary, you maintain division and you feed Manichaeism. In a counterproductive way, accusations and condemnations increase the risk of conflict because they force the others to defend themselves, to trigger natural mechanisms of aggressive defense that will maintain rivalry. In short, if you play at who's right, in quotes, one cannot and should not ignore that one necessarily intensifies or aggravates conflicts. One doesn't resolve them. So the question that arises is, are those who choose this method unaware that their attitude is toxic and counterproductive? Are they simply naive and immature? Possibly. Or are they fanatically convinced by the military financial powers that underpin their power that they are the guardians of a just war against evil? At the end of World War II, when the financial feudalities served by NATO established their power to the point of hyperpower, they gave themselves the right to designate the enemy, unilaterally if necessary. That is to say, they freed themselves from the need to have the blessing from the United Nations. From the Second Iraq War to Libya to the Ukraine War, they allowed themselves the privilege of intervening without a UN resolution in various forms, that is, of circumventing international law. But now everything has changed, as the British Prime Minister Starmer discovered. Everything has changed, he said, texto, not only because everything changes, Pantarei, as here as the philosopher Heraclitus proclaimed, but because the global West has abused power to the point that it has worn out its own power at an accelerated rate. If it had been possible to reign over the world without encountering any contradiction, as a certain Fukuyama had dreamed about in 1992 after the collapse of the Soviet regime, history would undoubtedly have been different. But that's not what happened. No need to rehash here the widely known history of the manipulation of color revolutions, Colin Powell's lies, NATO's, the just wars, NATO, which is present even in the Pacific Ocean area, or to mention the bailout of the banking system like in 2008. The diagnosis is clear. By exempting itself from the rules it imposed on the others, the potency of the global West has discredited the rule-based order and weakened itself to just becoming another power. What does this mean? The initial effectiveness or influence of this potency, characterized by the admiration it had been able to inspire, has gradually shifted toward power. That is, the constraint it exerts is perceived as illegitimate, as an obstacle and threat. It inspires more fear than respect, criticized by the growing protest of the BRICS, which our globalist ruling class wants to ignore. So what characterizes potency, strictly speaking, as Spinoza theorized, is the force to exist, that is to compose, or a force to maintain in the unity of a common notion the contradictions. Potentia posse existere, Spinoza said in his Ethics. And to exist positively means to exercise this potency and to maintain these contradictions within the composition or community of a higher unity. Power, on the contrary, is a force that lacks potency, an impotent force, because it does not want to overcome contradiction, but to suppress it. A major event at the time of Spinoza, but which he did not discuss, illustrated his theory of potency and commune notions, and this event was the conclusion of the Treaties of Westphalia in 1648, which ended 30 years of fratricidal inter-European wars. What I call potency erodes itself by wanting to prevent, to constrain, to fight or eliminate contradictions. And what I call potency strives to negotiate, in order to integrate, to unite, and to compose contradictions together. So their strategies are opposed. That of power is exclusive, that of potency is inclusive or integrative. It could be called inclusivist or integrative. So by choosing to designating the leading BRICS countries as enemies, the European intellectual and ruling classes have chosen the first strategy, that is, the choice of power relations. They did this against Russia in the post-Soviet era by moving NATO troops eastward, and now they're doing it against China, if not since the Opium Wars and the unequal treaties of 1840-42, at least since the arrival of Deng Xiaoping in 1978. So this choice of power against that of potency comes down to admitting, in my opinion, their impotency. So the remedy for Europe, I believe, stems from this diagnosis. Raising the level of the rule of law in Europe should therefore involve a reflection by the European ruling intellectual classes on the means of increasing collective potency, carefully distinguished from the means of power, which are most often impotent means. They demonstrated this generally by their rounds of sanctions, which have proven to be ineffective. So this distinction between power and potency, I think, is essential to avoid the pitfalls of geopolitics, and it's crucial for world peace. And it has already been at least partially discussed by some of the great authors of European civilization. We could quote Spinoza in his Ethics, the first part, or Hobbes in his Leviathan, chapter 10, Rousseau in his writing about Rousseau, the judge of Jean-Jacques, the first discourse. And then you have Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Bergson. But this distinction and its moral and political implications are absolutely non-existent in all the legal literature. And it's surprising that such an important philosophical distinction finds no echo in legal thinking. And it's very important, as I said. So this is surprising on the level of legal thinking. Now, before we conclude, I'd just like to point out to you one of the more morbid symptoms of Western scholarly rhetoric about power. This symptom is the denial or the refusal to recognize socialist China as even being worthy of being a political interlocutor. Since our academics, even in the Collège de France, denounce China as tyrannical, despotic, even totalitarian. So on these excesses, which we hear very commonly in our universities, discussed quite seriously, it's enough to listen to An Cheng, for example. And one could easily verify on the internet that there, in the universities, with the exception of the thesis which I myself defended at the Paris 10 Nanterre University in 2022, there is no thesis or scientific article on socialist democracy or consultative democracy, that is, on the Chinese paradigm of democracy, because there's a shared consensus among Western scholars and politicians to agree that, to plagiarize Sieyès, who said in 1789 that France is not a democracy and could not be one, to quote him, Sieyès. So our academics today repeat that socialist China is also not a democracy and could not be one. So I don't say personally, far from it, that we should simply accept on faith that China is a democracy and that we should praise it as such. I'm only saying that I find it shocking to refuse to discuss, just in order to respect scientific methods, since on the basis of a Marxist doctrine that has its coherence, Xi Jinping, in Chapter 8 of Volume 2 of The Governance of China, his book, in speeches that, let's not forget, have constitutional value in China, he gives the essential elements that make it possible to define what characterizes the Chinese model of socialist democracy. Therefore, I modulate and I rephrase the question that I asked earlier. Does treating our Chinese interlocutors with denial or contempt increase or decrease our chances of meeting them on the ground of a fruitful dialogue? The question contains its answer, and we can generalize it. What should our discourses and our choices be if we want to increase our chances of meeting our political interlocutors That is to say, if we want to dialogue with them, to link or establish exchanges that are profitable to our respective interests. Spinoza invited us to understand in his political treatise and to refuse to judge, to mock, or to condemn what we don't understand. But as indicated by the xenophobia and the shortcomings of Western university research, which has been massively reduced on this subject to the just studying the pamphlets in China, it's easier to judge than to try and understand. It is in this spirit that Montaigne also warned against what he called in his essays presumption, that is, the temptation to absolutize our particular point of view. It's the potential that we have the monopoly of truth. At the dawn of this long crisis of European culture, inaugurated by the fanaticisms of the 16th century, including the 16th century religious differences, he warned of the danger of combating difference as an error and error as a crime. When this presumption ignites the intellectual and political staff, its fanatical contagion inflames the social body with deadly fantasies that push them to war. So it's with a tribute to these philosophers that I would like to close this present contribution, a kind of manifesto in favor of multi-perspectivism, that is, in favor of reasoned confrontation of contradictory point of view. The history of Europe can be read with Montaigne, Baudin, Leibniz, Spinoza, and a few others as a long struggle against the temptation of the hegemonic universalism, which is the dark side of our modernity. The hegemonism of the Leaguers against the Protestants during the wars of religion, that of the European colonists against the natives of America, the Orient, and the Far East in the following centuries, and up to the hegemonism of the Wolfowitz doctrine. All this is the dark matter that an alchemy of common sense, of reason, can transmute into light. The hegemonic or unipolar universalism and to its uninhibited practice of double standards and to the military violence it calls for, we can try to respond by returning to historical common sense. That is, by a reflection that facilitates the return or the birth of this multipolar world. Philosophically, this essentially presupposes understanding that contradictions are not necessarily synonymous with rivalry and power relations, but also with conciliation, balance, harmony. This presupposes that we understand, contrary to what Starmer said, that nothing has changed, as he put it, because Heraclitus already analyzed in Greece. It is conflict, contradiction, polemos, that makes everything flow, that everything changes in the world at every moment. And the challenge for intelligence is not to suppress or to annihilate these contributions, but to make them play dialectically, as Nicolas of Cusa advocated. You know in the Schiller Institute very well about this notion of the conjunction of opposites. And Montaigne also knew about that. He was also reading Coups at the time, and he exercised himself this art of the conjunction of opposites all throughout his essays. So it is to the challenge of intelligence that the countries of the global south invite us today, and their principle of win-win agreements, or what General de Gaulle used to call the third way between liberalism and communism. So that is my conclusion on the diagnosis of this, of these pessimistic and warlike humors that are darkening Europe, but on which goodwill can base an optimistic prognosis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ravne. That was a very interesting and thorough analysis of what you see as composing Europe at this point. Is very, very interesting and in-depth. I know we're already getting a bunch of responses coming into what you said, and I want to go to some of those actually right now. Helga Tsepp-LaRouche, I believe you have a response to Professor Ravne, and then we'll go to Ray afterwards. So please go ahead.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Ravne. I think this was an extremely enlightening view of the matter. And I full-heartedly agree with you that, I personally came to the conclusion that the Chinese consultative democracy functions much better than the so-called liberal democracy for the very reason that the Chinese go through a very tedious process of accountability. Before the election, it goes from the local level to the regional level, to the provincial level, to the national level, whereby decisions are being formulated. And then after certain, like the 2 sessions, then the same consultative process goes back all the way afterwards. And that is in stark contrast to, there is a famous quote by a former social democratic politician in Germany called Müntefering, who famously said at one point that it is completely unfair to remind a politician of the promises he made during the election campaign afterwards, which I think is really hitting the nail on the head. Otherwise, I would just say that what the Europeans are doing right now, they attack so-called dictatorships in China and elsewhere, but there is not one evidence that the Chinese would have regime change in Africa or in Asia or Latin America. They don't do that. They don't interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. And on the contrary, if you look what the European Union is doing right now with member states, it's because the European establishment is linked to the deep state in the United States. And that's why they feel so absolutely, destabilized, because with Trump being in the White House going after the deep state in the United States, they feel that they have lost their most favored bondage. But if you look at the practices, what are they doing in Romania, for example? There was an election of a president, then the intervention came, they nullified the election. The population in Romania is very much on the side of this Ceausescu, so they called for a new election in May, and just hours or minutes before he could file his participation of the May election, he got arrested. I mean, this is unbelievable. There isn't, what happened to democracy in Europe? It does not exist. Likewise, in Slovakia, in Hungary, in Serbia, there is a serious complaint by the population that Maidans are against official elected governments underway. And I think this, is really something to be looked at, the connection of Europe to the deep state in the United States, because that seems to be the mechanism at work. And for the reasons, since you mentioned all of these philosophical disputes in European history, I think that what governs the Western elites is the same thinking like that of Joseph de Maistre, who in his famous letter to a Russian prince outlined exactly why they think that, you know, a certain oligarchy is superior to the masses of the people. And while the predicates have changed, it's no longer monarchies alone, but a financial oligarchy. They believe that they are better than these deplorables, as Hillary Clinton has called them. And I think that mentioning of Hillary of the so-called deplorables was one of the most incredible admissions of their mindset and image of men. But I think that whole discussion which you introduced is extremely valuable, and I'm very happy about it.
Thank you, Helga. I don't know if you have a response, Professor Ravne, but I also, please go ahead if you do.
Non, je n'ai pas de remarque particulière à faire, sinon que oui, vous avez, enfin oui, je pourrais peut-être abonder dans le sens de ce que vous faisiez remarquer, c'est-à-dire que
English.
No, I have no special, excuse me, I have no special remark on this, if only to confirm that what you said about the political organization in China of what they call their political procedures have now penetrated into our academic world here. And it's difficult for us to identify this because it's based on other principles. It's difficult to understand what's going on in China because it's so different from what we have here. But it would certainly be worth having a separate discussion or conference on this subject, which is very complicated. But I think that instead of trying to understand the academics in the West, we can see that they just are happy to condemn this kind of system, which is and most of the constitutionalists or the other intellectuals in the West, they denounce the pseudo-democracy in China, which they call a democrature, because they just judge without making the effort of trying to understand in what this democracy is made up of. And why China is coming out of this whole situation very well, we could say, in the past decades. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ravne. I know that Ray McGovern also has a response as well. Please go ahead.
Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
I can. Professor Ravne, great applause. I felt like I was back in graduate school. For the first time, a professor was making sense. Sei doch vernünftig. That's exactly what you were imparting, Vernunft, okay? So I thank you for that. And actually, I took notes like a schoolboy, and I have some remarks, and I'll make them as brief as I can, but I was really interested in the way you said, well, are the European leaders now naive? Or are they kind of guided by money? And you mentioned the military-industrial complex. I would suggest that it's the latter, plus the concept of racism. Let's not blanch before that word. Deplorables, well, that's one thing. But when you talk about Europe being a garden with the jungle outside of people who don't look like most of the rest of us, wow, Joseph Borrell, my God, he said it, didn't he? Well, so that's one point. The other, well, there are lots. I love your discussion of the differences of power. There can be power exerted as a very strong power, or there can be potency. Whoa, potency being inclusivity. Now, way back when I was studying Greek, I realized that there were two basic words for power. One was kratos, power over. You do what I say. I'm the hegemon. Hegemon coming also from Greek, to lead or to dominate, okay? So kratos was one kind of power. The other power was dunamis. Dunamis. Whoa, what's dunamis? That's relational power. That's where you realize that it takes as much power to absorb an effect as it does to cause one. And so it really is necessary to heed the needs of another if you want to have effective power over that other. Dunamis. Now, why does dunamis remain in my mind? Because in the New Testament Christian scriptures, dunamis is the word that Jesus uses for power, his kind of power, okay? So maybe I just add on that score that when he was asked, are you a king? Kratos, that's their whole idea, Kratos, okay? Are you a king? And he says, well, not the way you mean. And the Greek here is, it's not what you mean. It's not the way you order things. In other words, it's I am a king of a different order or relational order. The word he uses is cosmos, okay? Cosmos, well, cosmos, what does that mean? Well, what's the word cosmetic mean? It's the way of arranging. What's the word for the cosmos? So it's the way things are arranged, planets are arranged. So what Jesus is saying is, yeah, I'm okay. Yeah, I have power, but it's not the way you have arranged things, for God's sake. He didn't say for God's sake, but that's what he meant, all right? So this is just wonderful for me to realize that professors are still really relevant to the present situation. And if any more proof were needed as to the relative benefits of dunamis or kratos, you have the sanctions. Whoa, the archetypical kratos, power over. Now, what am I trying to say here? They didn't work, did they? So kratos doesn't work. It's very dangerous in today's world. And I just thank you again, Professor, for bringing me back to graduate school and helping the rest of us learn the difference between power and potency.
I second that. Hear, hear. If you have any response to Ray, please go ahead, Professor Ravenet, or we can continue.
Oui, je peux peut-être d'abord remercier Monsieur McGovern pour ses remarques.
I thank Mr. McGovern for his remarks, and I agree with what he said concerning racism. Anti-Chinese racism, there again, unfortunately, there's a long history in European civilization since Montesquieu. In the beginning of the 18th century, you find the myth of Oriental despotism. It's an invention of Montesquieu in the esprit des lois, spirit of laws. And contrary to Leibniz, he didn't know anything about Chinese culture. In his esprit des lois, he wanted to oppose the policy at the time. He was very worried about the power of the Jesuits at the time, who were very implanted in China and who understood China quite well. Montesquieu wanted to oppose them, So he wrote this spirit of the law to try and discredit them. So it was very often for children or for grandchildren of the Chinese today who are continuing this myth about Oriental or Chinese despotism. And I would also like to thank Mr. McGovern to his reference to Jesus, because I also thought about him when I was preparing this intervention, because this opposition of power and potency in the New Testament is the whole opposition between Jesus and Judas. Because between Jesus and Judah, you have the difference between the hand that's extended. Judas waits for Jesus to show how powerful it is, that he uses his arms, that he encourages his disciples to go out and kill the Romans, to cut their throats. And that did not correspond at all to the philosophy or to the teachings of Jesus, who showed how potent he was through his non-violence, through refusing to use violence. There's a misunderstanding there, and it's one which is very deep, which is written in the New Testament, and it's at the very deeply ingrained in our European civilization, in our great Christian civilization. So thank you, Mr. McGovern, to encourage us to continue to mediate about this New Testament, which is an intirable source of wisdom.
Great, thank you. Well, we have another video to present for the opening discussion, which I'd like to show, unless there's any more response, Helga or Ray, to Professor Ravenet.
Just merci, merci.
Wonderful. Okay, so next I'd like to go to a special video which was pulled together. It's actually part of a longer interview, which I think after some discussion we'll probably post the whole thing. But Dr. Mubarak Awad, who has been on a number of times on the IPC, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. He's a Palestinian American activist and co-founder of Nonviolence International. And he had a number of things to present for the IPC, including on the Oasis plan. If we can pull up that video, Dave.
And the agreement that we are calling for is not simply a political agreement for two states, but there must be an economic development so that you can give people the idea that this whole region is going to grow and that people are going to have a future. And therefore, we're actually encouraging people to endorse this Oasis plan. But one idea that I don't know if you're familiar with, because we have just recently made this public and really discovered it. Some of our researchers had found this out years ago. But back in the 1950s and 60s, it turns out that President Eisenhower had been calling for a version of what we're talking about. He called it Water for Peace. And he was promoting this during his term as president, but after he left office, President Eisenhower promoted this policy. There was a conference just before the Six-Day War with 6,000 participants from 94 countries came to discuss massive water desalination for Egypt, Israel, and Jordan, which would be the basis for peace between Israel and Palestine. And this policy was endorsed by President Johnson. But a week after this conference, the Six-Day War broke out, and you saw the result. But even after the Six-Day War, Eisenhower insisted. He died in 1969, but in 1968, he wrote an article for Reader's Digest where he actually said, you must have this water project to provide the basis for peace. And to those people who said, well, first we'll get peace, then we'll bring in the economy, Eisenhower argued, if you build up the economy, you're going to facilitate and help get peace. What do you think of that concept?
I think it will work. I think, Mr. Beasley, that your idea of having an oasis, it's not necessary for the Palestinian only, but for the Middle East. It's a great idea, and it will work. Palestinians are not interested in two-state, one state. We are now interested in living in our land. And you cannot live without water. So your idea of having water for everybody is an important. And to have water for drinking, water for all kinds of things like any human beings, any country in the world, use water as regular water in the homes and everything. That's an important thing. The idea of political, I don't think that water should be a political ways of dealing with issue. If you don't do this, we will cut the water on you. Okay, and that's where we are afraid. That's what we are afraid of our president in the United States, Trump. It's like we cannot feel whatever he says, he mean it. And so he said so many things against the Palestinians. He wants to take Gaza. Once he will say, no, we don't want the Palestinians to live in Gaza. You know, all those things, even if he just say them without meaning, it affects our feeling towards United States. Okay? And if we say an international group, United States should not be leading that group, because now we don't trust United States. From day one, when Israel was created till now, United States tried to say we are for peace, we are for two-state, but till now, United States didn't reach to a point that say, here is our ideas of a two-state solution and it have to be done. Not a single president said that, and they kept it for the idea that Israel have to decide. And Israel don't want to decide that. So we need international community to mean what they say and to accept those things as equal. With your idea, Mr. Plesky, is that you have to include other than United States. You have to include Turkey. You have to include even India. You have to include other countries, even from Africa, okay, rather than just European country. Because to us, colonization means so much. We are there under the Israelis because of colonization from the West. That's why we have to feel free to include Pakistan, India, South Africa, you know, and Arab countries, but it have not to be only European. To us, Europeans have nothing but a disaster for the Middle East.
Well, actually, if you look at their current policies in Europe, it's disaster for every other part of the world. So
Yeah,
therefore,
I mean, look,
yes, we absolutely agree with you. And I would like to just say at the end of this interview, we will continue this discussion, but
yeah.
we would like to encourage you to make this view that you're making known to these other countries and to the Palestinians and to people around the world, that if we join forces for this policy, we can bring about an actual solution. And that actually is what we call what Helga LaRouche of the Schiller Institute has called a new security and development order that respects the rights and security of all nations, big and small. So I want to thank you, John Goulart, unless you want to say a few more words here, and we'll end up our interview.
But I recommend one thing for you, which is important, and your idea is so important, and we could do it either in Egypt or Jordan or even in Palestine. to have a conference of those ideas of the oasis that you have in mind. And we could bring people to that from different Arab countries. That's why Jordan will be the best, because a lot of people don't want to go through an Israeli security in Jordan, and to have it under the King Abdullah or his brother Hassan or anybody in Jordan, and to say we want to have that as open to for other countries to be invited to it, and people have to not just hear it, but to commit themselves for it.
I think that's a great idea. Well, let's maybe we can work together to pull together such a conference.
I'll be more than happy to help you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Awad.
All right.
Thank you.
So thank you again, Dr. Awad, for sending in this video, and we'll make sure to make the interview available to people in the very near future. So I'm just going to make a general announcement, and we're going to go to the discussion period with the panelists, or with the panelists and the attendees. We've got about 250 people on approximately on this meeting on Zoom. If you'd like to participate on the Zoom meeting discussion, you must be registered. Please go to the schillerinstitute.com, and the registration page will be right at the top. You just click on that, you RSVP, and you'll get the Zoom link to join this discussion. And with that, please let me know, Dave, when we have cut the stream to protect people's identities.